If you are like me and you are a Sharon Eubank fangirl, I've got an exciting opportunity for you. This year, Sharon Eubank is the keynote speaker at Lift Up Your Heart, a Magnify event. It's a chance to hear from Sharon in person, up close and as powerful as ever, with her incredible insight that we all wish we had. Please bring the women you know, your sisters, mothers, daughters, and friends, and spend a meaningful Girls' Day at Lift Up Your Heart. You'll leave feeling restored, refilled, and recentered on Christ. The date is Saturday, October 25th at Mountain America Expo Center in Sandy, Utah, and all women 16 and older are invited to attend. Visit magnifythegood.com for all the details and to register. I'll admit, prior to this interview, I knew nothing about the Sikh faith. I didn't even know if you pronounced it Sikh or Sikh. For your information, the Goldbergs told me you can pronounce it either way. But I became enthralled by the beautiful tale of a young man who fell in love with a faith and became a disciple of Jesus Christ for the remainder of his life. I loved this remarkable true story, and I think you will too. James Goldberg is a poet, novelist, essayist, playwright, and occasional literary translator. He is the recipient of the Orson F. Whitney Outstanding Achievement Award from Storymakers and has won Association for Mormon Letters Awards in drama, novel, and creative nonfiction. By day, he writes for the church history department. His creative works include the 5 Books of Jesus, Let Me Drown with Moses, and the Bollywood Lovers Club. Nicole Wilkes Goldberg earned her MA in 2009, focusing on the cultural connections of life writing. Her work has appeared in Shofar, The Bard, and Moth and Rust. Though she teaches writing and Latter-day Saint literature at Brigham Young University, her full-time work is raising 4 children with her favorite collaborator, James Goldberg. The story of James' grandfather, Latter-day Sikh, is available in Deseret bookstores now. This is All In, an LDS Living podcast where we ask the question, what does it really mean to be all in the gospel of Jesus Christ? I'm Morgan Pearson, and I am honored to have James and Nicole Goldberg on the line with me today. James and Nicole, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I feel so lucky to have been able to read this book that you all have worked. I cannot imagine the amount of work that must have gone into this. I actually originally had a question in it about how you were able to get such good information. And then you kind of answer that question at the end of the book. So I decided we'd save our time on that. But I want to start out for those who, like me, before reading this book, know very little about the Sikh faith. How would you describe the Sikh faith, or what should we absolutely know for the purposes of this conversation? And I want to start out, I always thought that it was Sikh, but it's Sikh?
Well, that's interesting. When I was a kid, we tended to say Sikh more because if you say Sikh, people think you're like physically ill.
Right.
But that's like an anglicization of the word. In Punjabi, which is the language of scripture for Sikhs, you say Sikh. And so in the past couple decades, that's become more common, is just say it the way we always said it. And so, yeah, Sikh is the correct pronunciation. People understand you if you say Sikh. That's
okay.
Fine.
Gotcha. Good to know. Okay. Well, let's start then with having you just tell us a little bit about, kind of lay this groundwork, and then we will get into who this story is all about.
Yeah. A lot of Latter-day Saints today know a Sikh. Some Sikh men are very recognizable. So both Sikh men and Sikh women can be in what's kind of a lay priesthood for them. It's called the Khalsa, and they wear different symbols. One thing they do is don't cut their hair. And then men will wear turbans, right? The uncut hair goes under a turban. And so if you've seen a guy with a long beard and a turban, odds are that's a Sikh, right? I think as Sikhs have moved around the world more and Latter-day Saints have moved around the world more, we're meeting each other. My kids cheered one year in General Conference when there was a story about Sikhs giving service as kind of an example of here's the sort of thing we're trying to do as Latter-day Saints. So So I think there's lots of fun interactions and connections. In terms of what people should know, one thing that's cool is we're both relatively young faiths. So Sikhs are our older cousin in the world's religions. The religion started about 500 years ago in times that were really difficult in the north part of India and what's now Pakistan, divided times where there was a lot of struggle and conflict. And then this man named Nanak had a mystical experience with God and became the first Sikh guru, which is kind of like a prophet. Mm-hmm. And then there were 10 in succession. So he was one of a line of 10, and they built communities together and made new traditions that helped break down the barriers between different groups and really focused on family life and living honestly and doing charitable acts, giving service. And so not only is the history same, and kind of the feel, there's some overlap.
Yeah, and there was a lot of the teaching is about all people being equal before God, that men and women were all able to be equal before God, that there weren't castes, there weren't divisions, and that's a lot of what they continue to do. They open their churches to let all come and eat. I talk to people all the time when they find out about this book. They're like, "Oh, I've gone and I've had food at a Sikh Gurdwara." Like, they don't know the word Gurdwara, but at the church, and it's really good, and everybody sits down and eats together, which is one of those things with the caste system that was really frowned upon. And so there's a real beauty in that. But there's also such an emphasis on how the greatest pinnacle of life is to be in a family. This life is about family. And I think as Latter-day Saints, we can relate to that, because family is so central in Sikhism as well.
Absolutely. Well, I am excited for you both to have the opportunity to introduce us to who, as far as we know, was the first Sikh to become a Latter-day Saint. His name was, and you tell me if I'm saying this correctly or incorrectly, Gurcharan Singh Gill. Is that?
It's Gurcharan Singh Gill.
Okay, say that again.
You were so close. So Gurcharan, the emphasis is on kind of the last day, Gurcharan.
Okay. I'm probably not even going to attempt. I am terrible.
You can call him Gill. That's what everybody started calling him in the 1950s.
Okay, perfect. And this book is a biography that you both have written of him. So tell us a little bit about who Gill is and why people might want to know more about him.
So, like you said, Gurcharan Singh Gill is the first known Sikh convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is also the first mission president of the Indian mission when it opened in the early 90s. It had previously been a part of Singapore, and there weren't any missionaries when he was growing up. And so that's a really significant accomplishment. But he also is a pioneer in Indian family history, both in the church and for the people in India. So there was a period of time where everyone who went through the Provo Temple, if they weren't bringing their own names, were doing work for people from India, because he had submitted literally thousands of names.
Wow.
And so he has the ability, he can read old records in Urdu and, different scripts. And so he's been able to bring that to, bring that work forward. It's been pretty amazing.
Yeah. I think too, so Gurcharan Singh Gill is my grandpa. And so Nicole's known him for years. From the time we were dating, I was living at his house. And the scope of his life too is just kind of crazily epic. He was born in the 1930s under British occupation in India. He grew up surrounded by independence movement. He experienced what's called partition. When India finally got independence from the British, it split. They gave independence to India, which was mostly Hindu, and Pakistan, which was mostly Muslim. Sikhs were kind of caught in the middle, and a lot of people moved. There was a lot of violence. He saw that. He came to the United States in the 1950s, joined the church in 1956. So that's really quite early in the history of Indian immigration to the United States. And then, there was a lot going on in the 1950s in terms of how the U.S. was thinking about race and what was going on there. So anyway, the book is one person's story, but it's also two religions and two countries' histories that you're kind of working in on the side, seeing them through his eyes
and his experience
and his experiences, but getting a lot of how this world has worked.
Well, I also think, and I completely agree with everything you just said, and I'll say this, I think listeners of this podcast listen because they like hearing one person's story. Like that's what we do. But I will add that for me, I think it was fascinating to get a glimpse into a period of Latter-day Saint culture through his experience within the church as well. So I think all of those things make his story fascinating. You begin by giving, and you already mentioned that both our church and the Sikh faith are relatively young, but you begin by giving a brief introduction, a brief history of the Sikhs. And in the end of the introduction, you show how this history of the Sikh faith is not entirely indifferent from the history of our church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You also introduce readers to this guru that you already mentioned, Nanak. Can you share a little bit about where you see similarities between our two faiths? And I think specifically to me, kind of the history with Guru Nanak and Joseph Smith is pretty interesting.
I just want to preface, James will talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to say, in terms of part of what we wanted to do here, and the reason we do give that history as, a prologue, is to give the cultural and kind of an ethnography of where Gill is coming from, and to better understand those traditions and his beliefs and his life. And so we do try to include those things for like an ethnographical map of his experience as well.
Yeah, your life experience and where you comes from gives you different eyes to see things. And I think part of what's fun about the book is being able to see the restored gospel freshly through his Sikh eyes. So you can learn about this faith and maybe have conversation points for friends you meet who are Sikh, but also see the gospel in a new way because of this. And so, we wanted people to know that he comes from a tradition of seeking greater light and knowledge. And Guru Nanak, as a young man, actually one of the first stories about him is of his sort of spiritual, he's looking for answers around that Joseph Smith age in his teens, and doesn't go through some of the Hindu traditions. They had a symbol of your caste that you would wear. And he just said, I'm not going to take that, right? I don't think that's it. I think there's something more. And then, he has this visionary experience where he goes to a river to bathe and meditate and then just disappears. No one sees him for a while, and he comes back having had an encounter with God and starts teaching these teachings. And one of the first things he says is, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. So India at the time was very divided around religion, the same way that Joseph Smith is experiencing religion is supposed to point us to God, but often in practice, it ends up kind of pulling people apart and becomes very contentious. Guru Nanak lived in the same kind of conditions and said, no, it's not about our differences. There is a God, and he wants things for us. And then Guru Nanak sort of teaches that message. And then, I mentioned it earlier, but the message is not just there's a God out there, there's a separate reality, but that divine goodness and love can build us up and bring us into community here. So in a lot of traditional Hindu thought, there was this idea that there's like 4 stages to life. And maybe, with the belief in reincarnation, maybe this life you're not going to get all of them, but they're there. And the idea was first you're a student, you're learning. Then you're a householder, you're building a family and that kind of thing. Then you're in sort of retirement, you've stepped away from that and you can pursue spiritual things, right? Go out into the forest and just meditate on God. And then you might reach a point where you're free from all attachments and God is the only thing that mattered. And like you could go back into town and it wouldn't even matter that there's people around. It doesn't. You've sort of transcended everything. And Guru Nanak doesn't end up doing that. He's interesting as someone who has this mystical experience and then goes back to his wife and raises his kids and lives in family and says that householder life, if you're going to experience God, it's not separately out in the woods. It's while you're taking care of the people around you, while you're working. And just if you work honestly, you bring God to your work while you're serving others, right? That's where you'll experience God. And then there is this idea that meditation, right? Taking the name of God is how they talk about it, is not just for a few people who live a specialized religious life. That's anybody.
Yeah, that all people have access to that divinity.
Yep. So that's kind of the core of the initial vision of the Sikh faith. And that, it sounds a lot like Joseph Smith in some ways, looking for light, finding light, and sharing it in the way that everybody can participate. There's not a separate group of professional religious people who are different from the rest of us.
Okay. So with that backdrop, I want to kind of shift to your grandfather. Like many, I think, who are searching for something related to religion, your grandfather longed to know answers related to the plan of salvation. Can you explain to our listeners why it was that he kind of set out on this search for answers?
Yeah, so my grandpa's one of 10 kids in his family. Very close, loving family. He has an older sister, and then there were 9 boys. So
bless
some
his
people
sister.
will bless his sister. She was a really important example to him, just a little bit older. And we tell stories about him following her different places. When there were some guys from school who were mad at him, wanted to beat him up, he tried to go with his sister. She was kind of a wrestler, so nobody would mess with him if he just went with her and her friends. His dad actually never learned to read and write. His mom did to read Sikh scriptures, but his dad never learned to read and write. They'd been farmers a long time. His sister went to school and became a teacher, and she was kind of his example for seeking education. When he was 18 years old, his sister got really sick. She was married by that time and had a little boy. She got sick. He was with her, visiting her. They took her to the next town where there was a hospital. At that time in India, the hospital closed at night. They just couldn't staff. And so he's stuck outside the hospital, and they just found somebody who had some like army medical experience and took her to him for the night. And then she died that night. And that was rough for him to lose her around the same time his baby brother, in a way that some Latter-day Saint families might recognize. The youngest brother and the nephew are like the same age, right? So his baby brother had just been born, but had some complications when he was born. And so my grandpa was staying up. He and his dad would kind of take turns waking up at night to give a jab. His Nasib was his sister, Ajab was his brother. They'd give him medicine. About a month after Nasib died, Ajab died as well. And I think, tough to lose a baby brother because he'd been an important caretaker. He just felt so much affection. So he had these two losses in his life. And in Sikh thought, there's two things that can happen after we die. One is maybe we didn't learn all we need to learn and we come back again and we're born in another life. The other is they believe with us that like people are fundamentally divine. There's like this divine spark in us, but they believe that merges back into God. So like a drop works its way through the rain and a river into the ocean. That's the soul works its way through life. And ultimately you're trying to merge back into God. And my grandpa just couldn't shake the idea that his sister was still there as herself and his brother. And so when he came to the US, he started asking people questions about like, what happens?
Yeah. So he came to the US for college, for the opportunity to get a higher education not long after losing his brother and his sister. And so he was not, of course, familiar with Christian beliefs, but he was talking to a lot of Christian classmates, trying to figure out more about the afterlife. What does the afterlife look like? Where do people go? What happens? And people loved answering his questions. They were very supportive, but they didn't have answers that seemed to satisfy him, and people kept teaching. They were saying, well, you can find Jesus and be saved through Jesus. And he said, well, what about my sister and my brother who weren't baptized, who weren't, who never accepted Jesus? What happens? And they're like, and like, yeah, they're kind of out of luck. They had their chance. And that didn't sit well with him.
Right.
And so as he was asking some friends, one of his friend's mothers said, as he's asking about the afterlife, she said, you should talk to the Mormons because that was, she said, those are the people who know about, an afterlife.
Who have specific, this question of what happens if you died without being baptized, even though she wasn't a Latter-day Saint, right? She was a Pentecostal Christian. She had heard that we had beliefs about that. So I love that in his conversion story, there was somebody who was willing to say, I don't have some of the things you're looking for, but maybe these other people will.
And he had a classmate he knew was a member of the church. And so he asked her about it, and she felt very underqualified to answer all of his questions. As just a member of the church, you suddenly feel like, oh my gosh, this guy wants to know so much more. And she said, well, we're having stake conference on Sunday, and gave him the address. And so one of the talks was about the plan of salvation, and it just spoke to him so deeply. And he just thought, this is the answer I've been looking for. This is what I've been trying to figure out.
It's so neat to see, I think, anybody, the road that leads them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I love this story. It's about to get just a little bit crazier. He goes to the state conference, and at the state conference, correct me if I'm wrong, he randomly meets this family. He sees a boy. I'll let you go, James.
Okay. He's just found about part of plan of salvation that's important to him is what comes after, right? And the idea that there's work for the dead, everybody can access this thing, and that we have an identity that's stretched from before to after this life. And so that's speaking to his idea that his sister's still there. It makes sense. But he's hearing about a life before this life. In some ways, if you believe in reincarnation, the idea that you had a life before is not new. The idea that it was in this spirit world with God is new. It is wild to me that my grandpa immediately, after the meeting, he's looking around and he's heard about Joseph Smith and the first vision. And so this teenager, he sees a teenager who just makes him think of Joseph Smith, who he just heard about. And he goes, I wonder if I knew this guy in the pre-existence. I feel immediately like I knew him before he was born. And he just goes up and says, hello. And do you have a message from God for me? To a teenage kid, right? Whose name is Jan Johnson. And as it happens, Jan Johnson's parents are stake missionaries. So yeah, he's got a message from God for Gurcharan. And that's how they made friends.
It is so, I love that part of the story. So as his conversion progresses, he takes the missionary lessons in this family's home. They end up inviting him to come live with them. Talk to me a little bit as the posterity of this teenager that was searching for truth, or young man searching for truth. Talk to me about your gratitude now toward this family that was ready to give him an answer for the hope that was in them.
So the Johnson family, they are not only really important to Gurcharan himself, but also to all of the family. The kids called Norman and Gretna, the parents, Grandma and Grandpa Johnson. And, before Gill and Vilo got married, they, went and visited Johnson's to make sure that they knew Vilo, all of these kinds of things. Like they were his family in the US since he hadn't gone back to India. He hadn't, they were that. We have actually gone and visited and stayed with Jan and Julie Johnson. Jan has since passed away, but our kids called Julie, his widow, Aunt Julie. And, we tried to keep in contact with her and, keep those connections. And so it's, not just that they were there for a part of his life, they were always there throughout his life and really important in the family as time goes on.
Yeah. And I think it's incredible that these were people who shared the gospel with all of themselves, with love. It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to do a missionary discussion, but they were there for you. They wanted to hear your story. They wanted you to feel safe and connected. When I was a missionary, right, in the early 2000s, so like 50 years later almost, there was a senior couple who had somehow made the connection. I don't know if they saw a family picture with my grandpa or something, and they're like, oh, you're related to Gill, Gurcharan Gill. And Elder Spangler, the elder, was like, I joined the church through the same stake missionaries he did, through the Johnsons. And I love the Johnsons and I love Gill. And it was wild to me, right? That here's this guy who feels a connection, like we're all part of the same family. We call each other brother and sister in the church. And we talk about ward families. And I think a lot of people have felt that in degrees. I think the Johnsons just did an exceptional job at making it real. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we have felt that. I still sometimes talk on the phone with Julie Johnson. And certainly we're not the only ones. I am excited in heaven to discover all the connections of affection and sort of those bonds of the gospel that bind people. And how am I connected in ways I don't understand right now to so many of you who are listening right now? Because we have those links. We can't always see them, but they're there and they're real.
That's so beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing. What a beautiful tribute to that family. One thing that I found really fascinating is that you point out in the book that many people, especially I think within the United States, who are taught by missionaries already have a faith in Jesus Christ. They're Christians, just of different Christian denominations. But this was not true of Gill. He didn't know about Jesus Christ. He didn't know about the Bible. So why do you think this message of a savior resonated so much with him?
Maybe one thing I would say is I think the message of a savior intrigued and attracted him, right? He was talking to this Catholic priest. He had Pentecostal friends. And for him, there's different angles for different people based on their life experience, independent of religious experience. But like resurrection clearly was a big deal, right? For the questions he had. But I think the Savior meant so much more to him. We talk in the church sometimes about salvation and exaltation, and how the gospel, yes, Jesus saves individuals, but also can preserve those family relationships and sanctify them. And I think what hit him with that full spiritual force was the second part, through the plan of salvation, understanding the scope of what Jesus accomplished for us. That opened his eyes. And then, right, when he had this full panoramic vision of what Jesus achieved, that's when he really embraced Jesus as a savior and not just an interesting figure or an interesting possibility. And actually, it was interesting. My brother went on his mission to India later and said, if somebody was already Christian, there are a lot of Christians in India, right? Maybe not a huge percent of the population, but there's 1 billion people in India. So a lot of Christians to teach. When they teach them, they teach restoration first. When they taught people from other backgrounds, they often started with the plan of salvation, because understanding what Jesus did, right? That plan of salvation gives you a sense of that scope and what the atonement achieves. And then when you understand, okay, we're reaching our divinity, we're having our relationships sanctified. And how does that happen? It's through Jesus Christ. That makes sense. That bridges the gap. So I think uniquely through the restored gospel, he had a vision for why the atonement of Jesus Christ was so significant and so connected to these longings he already felt before he started looking.
So interesting. I love that they teach it in context. I think, you think about anything being presented to you out of context and how confusing that can be. And it makes complete sense that they would teach it starting with the plan of salvation. Gill had a fascinating experience when he went to receive his patriarchal blessing. And I'd love it if you two, when you tell this, if you could kind of go through to the interaction that he had with Hugh Nibley, because I also thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So after he was baptized, he was still in California. He was at Fresno State. He went to get a patriarchal blessing, and the patriarch really, he struggled when he met him, because he said, I don't know your tribe. And it's likely that he looked and he said, this guy is from India. I don't know what this means. I'm not able to figure out where these connections are.
Well, and there's kind of we get into it in the book and we don't need to in detail now, but there is kind of a racial context where in the 1950s, a lot of Latter-day Saints were still thinking about lineage in racial terms. And it was like, okay, people with Native ancestry, they're through Manasseh, right? Because of Book of Mormon. And we feel like Europe, somebody from Ephraim ended up in Europe. So a lot of them, we connect with that. And then it's sad, but we've got historical examples of Black people where patriarchs wouldn't name a tribe or would say they were outside Israel. And so, but India's like off the mental map, right? And so here's a patriarch who's a faithful guy trying to do his best, but I think understandably nervous about what do I say and where does this fit? And this guy's got dark skin and we have ideas about that, but also it's interesting and different. And so yeah, he actually, the first time Gurcharan went to get his patriarchal blessing, the patriarch said, because I don't know your tribe, like, give me time. I'm not ready to give you a blessing today.
Yeah. So a month later, he went and he got his blessing, his patriarchal blessing, which, was such a comfort to him and told him that, assured him that he was going to do work for his ancestors and assured him that he was, going to be able to share the gospel with his people, all of this kind of stuff. And so he loved this blessing and felt like it was such a comfort and a guidance for him. And then when he went to BYU, the professors in the religion department were fascinated by him because they were like, there's actually a funny family story they tell where he's, waiting with registration and somebody sees him and they say, "Are you Indian?" And he said, "Yes." And they're like, "We have a line for Indians." And he just thought that was great. And it turns out they're all Native Americans. And they, when he got to the line and they were asking his tribe and different things like this, that he realized the wrong kind of Indian. And so nobody had seen an Indian student on campus. This wasn't normal at the time. It's still not that normal now. But so he, of course, went to the foreign student office and worked with them. But there was just this fascination from the religion department, this convert from Sikhism, from India, who just had such a strong testimony and passion for the gospel. And so, Hugh Nibley liked talking to him to get his perspective. And he liked talking to Nibley to, learn more, and that he was just hungry for more knowledge. And Hugh Nibley said, "Look, I know this really good patriarch." Okay, he didn't say it quite like that because I just kind of made him sound like a gangster. But he said to him, he said, "I know this really good patriarch. I can get you a new patriarchal blessing." And Gill just...
And maybe we left out in his patriarchal blessing, after the patriarch had said, "Well, I don't know your lineage, I can't give it." A month later, he comes back. In that beautiful blessing, he was just told he's part of the tribe of Ephraim that has this commission to gather Israel.
Yeah.
And I think Hugh Nibley was going, well, does that patriarch really know? Is there something else?
Yeah, there's a little bit more to this story. So there was probably a little bit of that idea that we could find out the tribe in India, and Gurcharan just was like, "No, I like my blessing. I'm good."
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's one of those things, when we were writing the book, at first he told us about the blessing. And before we finished, he gave it to us and said, "I do want you to read this. I want you to read this." And as family, we felt like that's appropriate. And it's a beautiful blessing. Yeah. And that patriarch understood things about what he had been anxious about at the time that spoke to that. And it's just great. And I think, I don't know, the whole story is a lesson to me about the beauty of simplicity of the gospel and the importance of trusting in inspiration. We don't have to figure out everything intellectually and approach. And sometimes there's no grand secret, right? That what the patriarch finally did is said, "I don't know anything about India, but I know how to listen to the Holy Ghost. And I'm going to put my hands on his head and say what I feel inspired to say." And it worked. It spoke to him. It bridged this cultural difference.
And it was the blessing that Gill needed. It was the direction that he was longing for in his life.
Well, I think also it's a really beautiful lesson in contentment. Mm-hmm. I think there sometimes can be this tendency to, I wish that my blessing was longer, or my blessing is not as long as this person, or I wonder if there could be more. And for him to just be like, "No, I'm good. I like my blessing.
Yeah, this is for me."
Right.
And that's what matters, right?
And I love that.
And I hope we've communicated in the book Gill's personality, that he is a person. When we were still dating, when James and I were dating, I went to his cousin's baptism. And, at the baptisms, they always have the kids on the front row and the speakers are really addressing the kids. He was there with the kids on the front row, and raising his hand, answering questions, with all these little kids. And he's just so guileless and so open and so accepting. He's a beautiful person. And I just really hope in this book we communicate those kinds of things about him, that he is a person who says, I don't need a new blessing that is quote unquote better. I just want to do what God wants for me. And he is just that is his personality. And I just hope we all strive to be a little bit more like that.
I agree. I think there's a lot that I myself can learn from that. We mentioned already kind of the attitudes toward race around this time. And James, your grandparents have a beautiful love story. And I think the two of you did such a great job capturing that in this book. But they also dealt with a lot because of the interracial aspect of their union. I wondered if you could share a little bit about them, their love story, and what they faced, and why you think that we can learn from their love story.
Yeah. My grandparents were super important to me growing up, right? Kind of this just safe place and reassurance, and that sense of openness and humor Nicole mentioned was important. And so, we heard plenty of times about their stories. So in my family, it was told almost like a funny story. There's a specific part, and then I'll back up and tell some more. But their marriage was technically illegal. They got married in 1958 in Arizona, where her parents were in Mesa, Arizona Temple. And the day before the sealing, they go to get their marriage license. And when they go to get it, the secretary looks kind of nervous and is watching my grandpa fill out the forms. And when she sees he's from India, she runs and gets the clerk and then informs them they can't get married because there's a law in Arizona that a Hindu can't marry a Caucasian. And, in my grandparents' telling, he didn't mention this in the book, he'd been called a Hindu before. That's what people called people from India at the time. His first job in the U.S. was at the Hindu labor camp, but in California. But at this point, he's like, okay, I'm a Latter-day Saint. I grew up as Sikh. Like, I'm not a Hindu. I should be allowed. How does this even apply to me? And my grandparents would talk about how the clerk took his glasses and put them down on his nose and just looked at my grandpa and said, looks like a Hindu to me.
And then he would start laughing.
And then my grandpa would start laughing, right? About oh, how silly. And then he would explain that they go to the lawyers and work it out and finally are able to convince a judge that this law shouldn't apply, and they get paperwork filled out and they get married. And it was this funny story, right? Which then when Nicole was working on writing it and getting into all the research of American attitudes at the time and some of the attitudes in the church at the time, she's like, this is not a funny story.
That was actually their courtship and marriage were going to be one chapter initially. And so, we got all this wonderful information about the courtship and how beautiful it was. And then as I was getting into the weeds, that was the hardest chapter of this book to write, because there was so much suspicion around interracial marriage. And there was in the church, it was discouraged. And in, the laws of the land, it was illegal. And there were so many things, and the justifications. And, I went through church magazines looking at stuff, and it was just heartbreaking. It was so difficult to see what they were up against. And so, James and I went back and forth and wrote and rewrote and reworked that chapter because we wanted to give it the weight that it deserves to know that, you know, these people have put themselves on the line, that they're, you know, pioneers in a lot of different ways. And they really put themselves out there to be able to forge this path to say, you know, we can have an eternal family. And that was what was important to Gill and to Vilo, to say, you know, he was saying, you know, they said, you can go get married in Las Vegas. And he said, no, I need to be married in the temple. You know, this was what was important. The eternal family built around the gospel.
And I think when we tell the broader love story that starts before they get to the courthouse, that's what it's about, is two people who are really determined. They have a vision of marriage that's celestial. Mm-hmm. They're thinking celestial before we talked that way, and looking toward the temple. And that's true for my grandpa, who had heard this plan of salvation and understood the importance of temple ceilings and felt new in this faith that's very different and wanted somebody to be an anchor. And we talk about he did not come from a culture where you dated. So he had to kind of learn how to date and then learn how to like look for someone who was spiritually strong and knew what she wanted. And he found her, and he didn't care what color she was. And we tell my grandma's story, right, of having looked for a relationship and been through relationships with people who maybe would have looked good on paper, or other people in the ward and stake were like, oh, this is stake president's son, surely that's going to be a good relationship. And it was not. It didn't have that spiritual foundation of dignity, respect, moral consistency. And she said, no, I'm not going to marry someone who it looks like I'm supposed to. I need someone whose heart is in this, whose whole soul is in this. And when she found him, he's from India, right? We found the letter.
This was actually a really late development. We had already submitted a manuscript, and James's aunt found a bunch of papers from her great-grandma.
So this is Vilo's mom.
And we found a letter as his Aunt Janice and I were going through all these letters, the correspondence that her family got, and from Vilo, from Janice's mom. And the way she talked about Gill, she was like, he's a convert. He's so strong in the gospel. He has all of these beliefs, but there's a catch. He's from India, and she's, you know, reaching out to her parents for their guidance, for what they would think is best. And her mom had grown up in the LDS colonies in Mexico, and she had seen struggles with interracial marriages. She was very concerned. She was very concerned with how that would work for her daughter.
And I would say this is a time where I found a survey, over 90% of Americans opposed interracial marriage, right? So just like, overwhelming.
Can you even find 90% of Americans agreeing on anything? On anything. Ever. And at that time, interracial marriage, 90%. Just
overwhelming. But Gurcharan and Vilo felt this. They understood it. There was this spiritual need. They moved forward. They went and kind of worked to get family on board. And there were cool things like her sister, Amy, when they went and visited her and her husband, said, every marriage is an intercultural marriage. I'm a nurse. My husband's a rancher. We got to figure out culture, right? Her mom, Vilo's mom, had sent this long letter with concerns. And here's teachings of the time. Her dad sent one line, which was about the longest letter he ever wrote.
The only letter she remembers ever really getting from her.
Yeah, he was a good guy, but just solid, quiet guy. But he said, "Dear Vilo, if he is a good Mormon elder, marry him. Love, Joe." And that was it. He was somebody who said, I don't care if 90% of people think this is a bad idea. If you've got that core that spiritual core, everything else can work itself out building on that foundation. So they did. They got married. Not long after they got married, within weeks of their marriage, there was another talk at BYU warning people against interracial marriage that we talk about at the book. And my grandpa went and talked with a friend who was Japanese Canadian, a Latter-day Saint, in an interracial marriage. And they're like, oh, what do we do? How do we feel about this? And instead of focusing on, okay, is this good counsel? Where is this coming from culturally? They said, look, we got one life. We're married already. Maybe there are more challenges, right? But there's also, we have the spiritual strength and God can help us. And our job is in our situation, our life, not to think about what might work for somebody else, but to say, how do we put our trust in Jesus Christ and move through? That's what my grandparents did for decades. And they went through lots of different life experiences and things and had just a beautiful relationship, right? And I have fond memories it was during COVID. We had sort of a Zoom with my whole extended family. So my grandpa's Sikh relatives and my grandma had Alzheimer's at the end of her life. And I remember my cousins seeing just my grandpa feed my grandma and the way she still responded to him, right? She'd lost a lot of memory, but had those feelings of trust and affection. And seeing that, my cousins just said, that's so moving, right? That's them. These are the people we knew through all these years while our families were coming to the US and we were getting settled here. And we feel anchored still in that love and that spiritual richness and grounding that they always had. So beautiful relationship. An example of putting faith in Jesus Christ against the prejudices of the day.
Well, I think that you all do a beautiful job as well at showing us how lasting and beautiful their marriage was. And like you said before, your grandparents went on to lead a mission in India, which is something that your grandpa had kind of, it seems like, always wondered if he would have the opportunity to return to India as a missionary in some capacity. And so I wondered if you could talk to me about how your grandfather's lifelong service in the church influences your own service and dedication to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
So one thing that is really interesting about Gill and his service is that whether he is mission president or he's a stake president and in these leadership callings, or he is teaching a family history class, he is completely dedicated. We share a story from early in the 1960s when he is deep into his PhD work and he has, a very young family. He is called as a 70s group leader.
They had Ward 70s at the time.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just, this is like, you have the elders, but you also have the 70s, and he's part of that group. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he is the 70s group leader, and half the 70s quorum, there are about a dozen guys, they never come to church. And by never, they haven't been there for 30 or more years. And he's really intimidated by this calling because he sees that, okay, he doesn't want to just work with the guys who are there, but he said, I don't know if I have the energy and the capacity to work with a quorum who mostly isn't there. And so he really struggled, but then he said, you know what, I'm going to take this on. And he has this experience where he is at the library at the University of Utah. He's doing research and he just keeps getting inspiration over and over. It's interrupting his research. It's distracting him. And so he puts aside his books and he kneels down and he prays, and he has this inspiration to reach out to one of the brothers named Orland Tapp, and that he needs to go and he needs to find him. So he kneels down in the stacks and prays and is led to Orland Tapp. He tells this story in multiple versions of his own life history, autobiography, and letters. This was a really important turning point for him. So he goes and he reaches out to Orland Tapp and he says, I need to call you as a home teacher. And I think now we sort of think as home teachers or ministering brothers and sisters, and we're like, well, everybody gets that calling. But he goes and he says to a man who has not set his foot in a church building in 3 decades, I want to call you as the senior companion, as a home teacher. And Orland Tapp says, yeah, I have been wondering how to get back to church. I've been wondering about this. And he tells his story about, not feeling like he was really welcomed after being on the basketball team and the program was discontinued and he didn't have the clothes. And so he started smoking and he started a business and he stopped going to church and just had his life. And then not long before this visit from Gill, he had a heart attack and his doctor said, if you want to live longer than 6 months, you need to stop smoking. And so a few years later, there he is, and Gill is visiting him every single day. And they're talking. And by the end of the week, Orland Tapp says, what do I need to do to get a temple recommend? Like, again, going back to how important the celestial, eternal covenants are. And so when, Gill went to church and he had talked with the bishop and they go to turn on the lights in the chapel and on Sunday, and there's Orland Tapp waiting for sacrament meeting to begin. And it just goes through the story. We go through the story in detail. But I think, Orland Tapp says, I want this other brother to be my home teaching companion. And so they reach out to him and we start getting all these brothers coming back to church. And that was the energy that Gill brought as mission president. He said, we have members in India, but for various reasons, they're not coming to church. So let's start with them. Let's start with...
In a country with 1 billion people, he said, I'm going to spend 6 months at the beginning of my mission focusing on inviting people back.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's ministering to the one. It's listening. And helping people feel that, like, when you're there, you're all there with them and their experiences are important. I also think he's a good example of being non-judgmental about, right? Brother Tapp could tell his story and Gill is not telling him, well, you should have been more valiant. You should have done this. He just goes, okay, that's where you were. Thank you for telling me what your experience has been and where you come from. Where are you going? Right? What do we do next?
Yeah.
And that ability to honor where people have been and then
meet them where they are.
Meet them where they are and move forward. I'm not my grandpa, but I do try to emulate a little bit of that ability to listen to somebody and let them be themselves and let them bring themselves back to what they could find here, right? I've had people, we've had a lot of talks with people who have had tough experiences with church, and sometimes they end up saying, you're allowed to separate the way you grew up and some of the experiences you had growing up from the way you approach things now, and let's find your way to come.
Yeah, and come with what you have and where you are and what relationship you want with Christ and with the gospel. And I just think Gill is such an amazing example of that he says, everybody has something to offer. everyone in the church has something to offer, and you have something to offer. And I feel like that has been such a big influence on the way that we teach our children service in the church, as well as the way that we try to, just welcome people. I was primary president up until about 6 months ago, not quite 6 months ago. And one of the things my counselor, who was just amazing, she said at the beginning of the year, she said, let's go and let's just go talk to all of the kids who don't come to church, and let's invite them. And we went around and we talked to their families and we gave them little invitations and different things. And then the next week in the morning, one of the boys was getting up and getting ready, and his mom said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I want to go to church. I was invited." And I think that's what Orland Tapp was looking for. That's what all these members in India were looking for. That's what people are looking for, is that invitation. And if we can learn something from Gill, it's to be the people who invite.
I love that. And I think that is something that President Nelson models so well, is this culture of inviting, which then helps us move into action rather than just hearing. I love that you talked about, honoring where people have been. And I think that that's something that Gill did so well. That was one thing that impressed me in everything that I read in the book, is that he seemed to always honor his heritage and where he had come from, while also embracing this new faith. And that seems to be something that he has passed on to both of you, because that's what you're doing with this book, is honoring your heritage. So talk to me about what it meant to both of you to complete this project. And James, obviously, I think it's incredible that you're able to do this for your family history. I also think, as a wife, Nicole, what a neat thing to be able to honor your husband's family history. So I'd love to get both of your thoughts on that.
I'll just say quickly, she got invited first. My grandpa, he was happy. She'd come to really, I think when you decided you were ready to get married was after coming to a Sikh wedding and meeting the whole family and being like, okay, I can trust this guy because lots of people know him and they know strengths and weaknesses, and I can live with both. But no, when my grandpa decided, he said, he didn't actually say a biography. He said, we need to write something about Sikh tradition, Latter-day Saint tradition, right? And give people that bridge. And Nicole, would you do this for me? And then I sort of invited myself.
Well, and James was like, can I write it with you, please? And so I was really grateful, and that really touched me that he asked me to do that. I do want to say that one thing, the Gill family is very proud of their heritage and being Gill family. And I will joke and say, oh, well, Bapuji, that's what we call him. They say it's my Gill genes. And he just loves that I'll say I have Gill genes too. And so from the beginning, I felt so much a part of this family. And James and I were in graduate school when we met, and he was living in his grandparents' house in Provo. And so they just embraced me fully. And I was a divorced single mom. So that was kind of a big deal to have these beautiful people just say, you are welcome here, and you are part of this family, and that they wanted, they were worried that James was going to scare me away, and that means a lot when you're a single mom to have people say, like, okay, just be smart about this, And so that was just really, from the beginning, I've just felt like a part of the family. It is funny because a lot of James's cousins, so his generation, they are amazed at how well I know Gill family history. And I said, well, before James and I were even engaged, while we drove to this wedding in California, he brought the Gill book, which is a family history book, and started showing me and quizzing me on the relationships, and there's like my 4-year-old daughter falling asleep while we're talking family history in the van. So
if you see in the front of the book, there's like a table of Gills. He's one of 10 kids, right? She knew all the brothers and all their wives by the time she got there to the wedding to meet them.
And admittedly, I don't know everybody who is in our children's generation. I don't know everybody. A lot of kids have been born, but it is fun. It is fun to be a part of that family. I grew up in a really close family, and my mom's parents were always a big part of my life. And I was always, close to my grandma on my dad's side, but I didn't have a lot of cousins. My parents both came from small families. And so being able to be part of this huge Gill extended family has been an adventure, and it's so fun for our kids, and it's so fun to have those opportunities.
Well, I think, sorry, James, really quickly, I'll just say this. I think that it was smart of Gill to want Nicole to write it, because it's not so deeply ingrained that it's the stories you've heard your whole life. You're able to invite us into this view of this incredible family.
Oh, thank you. I really hope that's what we did. So
no, I think you did a wonderful job. James, were you going to say something and I cut you off?
Oh no, I'm glad for the work she did in this book. You'd asked about kind of the deeper Sikh roots, and I think if there is truth from God in this world, hold on to it, right? Like don't give it up wherever you find that, wherever it comes from. So it was really important to my grandpa that like the goal is not just to be a picture perfect ideal Latter-day Saint, right? The goal is God, and to be changed and exalted as a family and as a human race by reaching for God. And so whatever he had from his mom, he says sometimes he had 5 moms through life, right? Because his mom and his aunt and his other aunts he lived with when he was away at school, and Gretna Johnson, right? Here are all these women who had spiritual experiences and different knowledge and wisdom and gave that to him. And like he would not give up the things his mothers knew. Right? Got that anti-Nephi Lehi kind of sons of Elam in faith. And I was just raised that way, right? That if you find truth anywhere, treasure it and hold on to it. So that's been important to us. And I think that's good for my kids. My one of my brothers said once, if there were one religion teaching us something, it would be maybe a little easier to rebel or to go, that's just tradition they just made up. We've got Jews on my dad's side. We got Sikhs on my mom's side. He said, when there's 3 witnesses, you just got to go, okay, there's something here. There's something here. And so I think I would urge everybody, whatever spiritual roots are in your family, hold on to them. Whatever you find, just looking around, whatever you learn from when you're interacting with a friend, right? What's the reason for hope in them? And you learn that. And as they listen and open up, you'll be benefited and edified. And sometimes that helps somebody else open to maybe receive more from you, whether that means they end up making these covenants and becoming part of our people, or whether they just take a part of what you believe and integrate it into their own spiritual experience with a different faith. Either way, those encounters can only be good if we reach for the good in them.
I completely agree. Well, James and Nicole, this has been such an enjoyable conversation for me. Thank you again for all of your hard work. My last question for you both is the question that we ask at the end of every episode of this podcast. And that is, what does it mean to you to be all in the gospel of Jesus Christ?
I think for me, especially as we're talking about this book, what it means to be all in is to bring my whole self. That in the church, I'm not trying to perform some idea that's out there about what a Latter-day Saint is supposed to look like or sound like or whatever else, right? It's not for that. I'm supposed to bring everything I am and everything I have and what I've inherited, what came before me, and lay it all on the altar before Christ. And it's consecrated to me, right? When I take these things to Jesus, they're made more holy, and he brings all truth back into that one great whole. And so yeah, being all in means loving and serving and bringing truth to all I do, but also that it means that I bring all the parts of my culture and heritage and understanding, that I bring my insecurities in a self-conscious way, and they're part of my worship. And so, yeah, I want to bring my whole self to Jesus, and I want to see what he can make of me and what he can make of us as we all bring ourselves and come together.
I thinking about this question, I thought, okay, there is the personal, individual, how am I all in? But when I think of all in, I think all of us. I think of everybody, that we are all in this together, not just as Latter-day Saints, not just as, religious people, not just as Sikhs, not just where we are, but that Christ's atonement is for all of us, that we are all in this mortal life and going through these challenges together. And so the thing that we need to do is support each other and be there and reach out and take care of each other and be kinder and be more open and more loving. And I really feel that being all in, being a representative of Jesus Christ, being a member of this church, it fundamentally means that all are welcome, all can be a part of this. And I feel so deeply that what we need is more openness. We need more of that love, like we learned from Gill in this book, and we need more of that willingness to be open for each other.
Thank you both so much. So inspiring both to hear your testimony and to be introduced to Gill's testimony. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
We are so grateful to James and Nicole Goldberg for joining us on today's episode. You can find Latter-day Sikh in Deseret bookstores now. As always, a big thanks to Derek Campbell of Mix It 6 Studios for his help with this episode. And thank you so much for listening. We'll look forward to being with you again next week.